Introductions, well, everyone stated. Brother Pablo, also known as Frater Palamedes Ardentis. I come from Scarlet Woman Lodge in Austin, and why am I giving a talk in particular about Catholic esotericism? Well, here we see St. Peter at St. Peter's, St. Peter's Basilica, the very center of Catholicism at the Vatican. Well, I was raised a Catholic. You know, a lot of people make the mistake of saying that they're born Catholic. One does not become a Catholic until baptism. So unless you're baptized coming out of that womb, I don't believe you. So I was raised a Catholic, very much a folk Catholic in the Latin American style. And then my sort of rebellion was to become a traditionalist Catholic. And so I became a very Latin Mass, traditional ways, pre-Vatican II sort of Catholic. And I decided early on that I wanted to become a priest. And so I went to the seminary. I like to say it's just more proto-seminary. Never really got into the formal stuff, the really formal stuff, because I left after a year to become a Jesuit priest. Very fascinated by the Jesuits. I then left the church, came back again, got super traditionalist Catholic as my response, became a member of Anglican Youth Catholicism, which I'll go into a tiny bit about it soon. Now, after many paths, I'm now here before you, an ex-Catholic seminarian telling you about Catholic esotericism to a Thelemic body. So, you know, hope is possible. So what is the Catholic Church? Raise your hand if you've heard of the Catholic Church. That's right. Why you've heard of the Catholic Church? Because it is the world's largest Christian denomination and the second largest religious sect in the world, next to Sunni Islam. It has 1.3 billion members and is 20% of the world's population and is 2,000 years old. Like, if you haven't heard of it, anywhere in the world actually, except like remote corners, I'd be very surprised because the church has a presence in almost every town, every human population on this planet. Now, one thing you may not know is that, so the church is the Latin, what we know about the church is known as the Latin Church. It is where we know about the Roman rite, the Roman Mass. However, within the Latin Church, there are also different rites. The Latin Church itself has 15 different rites of either extant use or non-extant use. For example, the three main ones are the Novus Ordo, which is the one you're likely to run into. It's the post-Vatican II Mass. There is the Ordinary Rite, which is pre-Vatican II, but not exactly Latin Mass. And then there's the Extraordinary Rite, which is the Latin Mass, Tridentine Mass, dating from the Council of Trent. And then there's other ones that were more local, like the Sarum Rite was for the English. There, I think, Mozabim Rite. There's a rite, the Archbishop of Milan is allowed to practice his own rite of the Latin Church that doesn't even look like the Roman Mass. So that's very fascinating. Most people just think it's one universal thing, but it's not. And further into that, there are 23 Eastern Catholic churches that are in communion with Catholic Church, which means that they acknowledge the Pope and acknowledge other Catholic concepts, but they have their own rites and their own patriarchs that, you know, swear their fealty, have apostolic succession from the Pope. For example, Brother Kim and I went yesterday to a Byzantine Catholic Church. These are Russian Catholics, Russian Orthodox that have come into communion with the Catholic Church. The Anglican youth, what I used to be a part of, are Anglicans and Episcopalians and what have you that have converted and become Catholics. And they maintain some of their rites, like the Book of Common Prayer and stuff like that, and combine that into their own Mass. They would be counted as a rite of the Latin Church, though, because their Mass most resembles that, and they have more in common with the Latin Church than any of the Eastern churches. They're not a separate church. They're known as an ordinariate, special order. So there's, in the Catholic Church, one of the most crucial things about it are the 7 sacraments. Old Catholic images are really cool. So there is the church, the city on the hill. You know, I mentioned that in the Sikhism talk a little bit. So Christians have that very concept of the city of the hill. There's the Christ and the sacraments that flow from it. Baptism, Holy Eucharist, confirmation, penance, extreme unction, holy orders, and matrimony. These last two are not required. Neither is that one really. It's just expected that you'll choose one of these and that when you're sick, you'll try to get the unction. You know, it's your forgiveness of sins just in case anything happens to you, and a blessing to try to heal you from your sickness. And, you know, of course, this is Catholics as sheep because they love that imagery, feeding from the streams, the holy streams of the sacraments that sustain them. Baptism, of course, when you're young or if you're a convert, whenever you convert. Confirmation occurs later on after you've had your first Holy Eucharist and your first penance. Traditionally, this is done sort of like in your teenage years, and then your confirmation usually done when you're like 16 to 18 sometime. It may change depending on how fast your family wants you to get confirmed. I didn't get confirmed until I was late teens, early 20s. So. And then, of course, you're expected to choose between matrimony or the holy orders, which is priesthoods, monks, etc. So Catholic doctrine is summarized in a text known as the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You can buy these almost at every bookstore, especially if you go to a Catholic church at their bookstores. They usually have a copy of the Catechism. You want to know what Catholics believe? Buy the Catechism. And you'll have, for the most part, what you need, at least in regards to exoteric belief. So when it comes to church authority and the church itself, there are three pillars. These pillars are known as sacred scripture, holy tradition, and dogma. So scripture, of course, being the Bible. Tradition being, what has developed over time towards, from the church fathers, from early Christianity, from the apostles, traditions that have developed like that. And dogma being what is interpreted through the magisterium, basically the teaching authority of the church. Which is, new problems pop up, and the church is able to say with authority, as this being one of the pillars of the church, being like, for example, there's a great book by one of my friends who's actually the Pope's astronomer, Brother Guy Consolmango, who wrote a book about what if we run across aliens? What is the church's position on this? And the church is already set because, they have already developed in the magisterium what to do if they run across other conscious beings, And so this falls into the dogma sort of point because it is the teaching tradition of the church. So we can't really talk about Catholicism without examining its central rite. Just as we have our own central rite, they do, and that is the Catholic Mass. Now, we make the mistake of believing sometimes that the Mass is all there is, when the church itself has a wide variety of rites, prayers and hours and what have you, and I'll get into those in a little bit, but let's discuss the Mass. So the first part of the Mass, it was known as the Mass of the Catechumens. This is the introductory rites and the liturgy of the Word. The liturgy of the Word reading when they read from the Bible and whatnot, and whenever a priest is not required to go up there and give a sermon, but can give a sermon. Also, let me say that I'm using what would be considered right now the rubric for the Tridentan Masses and Novus Ordo Masses and ordinary Masses in a sort of sense. Eastern Catholics might have a different rubric, and Anglican use has a somewhat different rubric. So definitely do your own research in regards to that. Then the second part is known as the Mass of the Faithful. In old mystery religion times, I always say, let us remember that the Catholic Church is just the most successful mystery religion of all time. So the second part is the Mass of the Faithful. This includes the liturgy of the Eucharist, the communion rite. Now, in the catacomb times, and in olden times, especially in medieval times, there was the position of the porter. It was my favorite position to play when I was a traditionalist Catholic. The porter is a minor order, stands outside the door to the church. And basically, when the Mass of the Catechumens is over, he locks the doors and stands guard. This was because back in the day, when it was more of a mystery religion than it is now, the communion was only for the baptized. The non-initiated could not partake of the mysteries of the Eucharist. And so that's why the Mass is kind of divided into two parts. Now, the Eucharistic mysteries are central to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church holds many mysteries, whether they be, the purity of Mary, the incarnation of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, but the Eucharistic mystery is central. Just in the same way that it kind of is with our own Gnostic Mass. We have a different approach to it, but to the Eucharistic tradition is more along the lines of recreating the moment of the Last Supper, when Christ shared his body and blood with his apostles and disciples. Now, the importance of the Eucharist is tied into the theory of transubstantiation, which is the belief that that body and blood becomes literal, but most importantly, metaphysically, the body and blood of Christ. You are consuming the spirit of Christhood, in a sense. Not zombie eating the Jesus, but consuming the Christhood.
The Catholics are cannibals.
Yeah, I've always liked to make that joke, sacramental cannibals. So because the Eucharist plays an important part, one of the central parts of the Eucharistic mysteries doesn't even take place in the Mass itself. It's the Eucharistic Adoration. So the Eucharistic Adoration is when the Eucharist is enshrined and put in something as awesome as this. This is a really metaphysical portrayal of Eucharistic Adoration, with even the saints of heaven and the angels, adoring the Eucharist, because it is the incarnation of Christ. Therefore, one of the central elements, and I used to do this all the time, people will show up, and usually a chapel is set up, and an altar is set where the Eucharist is placed, in a beautiful chamber, and people show up and they adore it through prayer or through meditation, contemplation, what have you, or through the singing of hymns. As such, that it's to the average Protestant Christian that will seem heretical in a lot of ways. A lot of things do to Protestants, but this in particular because it seems like the worship of an actual item, the adoration of a particular item. But it just harkens back to how the Catholic Church has never really abandoned its entire concept of being a mystery religion. It's just kind of been subsumed by the fact that now it's gigantic mystery religion. Particularly popular in Latin America, when I was there, it was my aunts and the old ladies would hit up the church every day to do at least an hour of Eucharistic adoration, because it was viewed as like a meditative aspect that would bring you closer to Christ. Now, since we're speaking about Eucharistic adoration and devotion to Christ, there are two devotions that are very central to the Catholic Church. Also, before I go into that, let me show you. The sacrifice of Mass is offered for four ends: adoration, thanksgiving, atonement, and petition. It's viewed as the grand ritual. You will sometimes see even, especially in the 1800s, I think John Cardinal Newman and some other folks refer to the Mass as having a particular magical formula that must be followed in order to achieve the results of giving adoration, providing thanksgiving, supplicating atonement, and asking petition. And these all happen within the mysteries of the Mass. Now, nowadays, this is also an interesting thing. Nowadays, you'll see the priest facing the congregation. That is the Novus Ordo Mass. The traditional Mass since the Council of Trent in the 1500s was to face towards the altar because the priest was viewed as not being there for the congregation. The congregation was there as being there to see the priest conduct the rites towards God. God is, where the Eucharist is kept in that chamber. So, two major devotions within the Catholic Church. They're known as Christ devotions and Marian devotions. Marian referring, of course, to Mary, Mother of God, as known in the Catholic Church. So Christ devotions fall usually into two major categories. One, visions of Christ, and the Stations of the Cross. So let's go to the visions of Christ a little bit because they're mystical, crazed elements. So I like to use any example I can to use a Caravaggio painting. So here is a great one. This is Paul's conversion on the way to Damascus, one of the most famous Christ visions. For those of you who don't know, Paul got knocked off his ass while he was riding to Damascus to persecute some Christians. He was a Jewish Roman who hated Christians and got knocked off his ass by a bolt of light. And in the bolt of light appeared the Christ and told them, why do you seek me? And Paul, in that moment of adoration, realized he'd been wrong all along and became one of the great early mystics of the Catholic Church because of that. We have an image of Paul nowadays as being like, a staunch lawgiver who kind of ruined Christianity. But and that may be true in its own ways, especially the kind of Christianity we tend to embrace ourselves as Thelemites. But Paul, for the longest while, was viewed as being a wild mystic. He saw Christ. He wasn't an apostle. He spoke of Christ in these concepts of love and truth and everything like that, and wrote letters about Christ as if Christ was his best friend. And so Paul's vision is sort of like the building block for what would later become visions of Christ that various later mystics would get, including one that Thelemites will find particular because of the concept of the mystic marriage. Here you have St. Catherine of Siena marrying Christ. The mystical marriage is twofold. It's a mystery in and of itself. The church is viewed as the bride of Christ, as the bride of God. And the church in totality includes us. So the church as a whole is the communion of saints. It is the church now, which I always forget what the exact title is for it, The church militant, which is us now, the church penitent, which is if one believes in purgatory, not a requirement in the Catholic Church, then one would believe in the church penitent, which is those awaiting salvation. And then there's the church triumphant, the guys who already made it. And they're all viewed as being together in the communion of saints, as one church. And this whole church is the bride of Christ, in the sort of sense that when Catholics ask saints to intercede for them, it's like asking a fellow church member to help them out. It's not in the sense of praying to a god or like a lower god in a sort of sense. It's the belief that your friend made it out of jail, now they can get you things in jail. Think about it more in that concept. As banal as it may sound, it's your friends out there can now smuggle you things into your cell. Yeah. And so it's in that sort of sense. They have the ear of the beloved of Christ. So St. Catherine of Siena had a vision while contemplating. Contemplation being very important to Catholic mystical practice. So while contemplating the mysteries, she had a massive vision in which she was transported into the heavens, and Christ placed a wedding ring upon her finger and said, you are my bride now. Be given unto none other except me and my mysteries. And especially in modern esoteria and the occult, Crowley was a big fan of this concept of the mystical marriage, explored in different ways. I forgot her name, who was married to an angel, and Crowley was a big fan of hers.
Autocratic.
Yes, autocratic. Autocratic would be a modern proponent of the mystical marriage idea. She married an angel and had wild sex with him a lot. Now, since chastity is more important in the Catholic Church, that didn't quite happen with St. Catherine of Siena, but they had a happy and fruitful marriage, which meant even that she didn't become a nun, because she viewed herself as having already been married, and therefore could not become a nun, which confused nuns, but because they viewed themselves also as brides of Christ and etc. But this is a particular mystical vision, and so the mystical marriage becomes this thing, this tradition that continues on, especially after St. Catherine of Siena, where people are very enamored by this concept. To the next person that ended up having also a mystical marriage, but had a far more sensual experience, was St. Teresa of Avila. You may be very familiar with her ecstasy. The ecstasy of St. Teresa of Avila is one of the great mysteries of the medieval Renaissance Catholic Church. Basically, she had engaged in a mystical marriage as well with Christ, as I guess as one does, except one day a seraphim came and showed up to her and basically asked her if she wanted to innately understand the mysteries of God. And of course, she was just like, I'm not worthy, but please, let me understand, even if it burns me from the inside out. And so Seraphim pulled out a lance, arrow, what have you, and just plunged it repeatedly into her abdomen area, causing her to ascend into divine ecstasy. Now, the ecstasy, as the way she described it, is in the same way that, say, a Sufi dervish would describe their ecstasy, or a Hindu monk would describe their unity with Shiva, or what have you. It was the sort of almost sensual, divine element of truly uniting with one's beloved. She viewed herself as being completely carried away and no longer existing in a sort of purity of essence. I like to think about it also when it comes to the concept of the 0=2 formula within Thelema, of non-being and being. The ecstasy of St. Teresa seems to evoke that sort of concept as well. And then there is another, usually when people see Christ, something happens. Paul fell off his horse and, basically broke his skull into liking Christianity. St. Catherine married Christ. St. Teresa did more than marry Christ. And St. Francis of Assisi got the stigmata. Now, that's a cool representation of Christ, and that's exactly how I believe to saw him, with red wings and all over his body. And it floated up into the air, another monk there being afraid, of course. Francis saw him, and as Francis had closed his eyes out of fear because he didn't know what was happening, he opened his eyes and saw the face of Christ and immediately received the stigmata. His hands were pierced, and his feet, and his side, and they all started bleeding. And it's in this sort of way, in the Gita, it's described of when the prince sees the monstrous form of Krishna, It's do not gaze upon my monstrous form. In the same way, it was him seeing his God basically caused a physical reaction that marked him for the rest of his life. That was the first recorded major stigmata of St. Francis of Assisi. Which is interesting because we now know Francis of Assisi not because of his stigmata, but rather because of his love of nature and, talking to animals and stuff like that. Saints do all sorts of weird things, but the more mystical elements of them are always tied to their visions and their unity with God, or the Godhead in some way. Those are just 4 examples. I can't give you the vast multitude of examples. The Catholic Church is gigantic. I'm sure you can find various other Christ visions claimed, some more likely than others, in a mystical concept. People are always claiming to see Jesus on a loaf of bread, what have you. But if anything, the history of the Church has shown that when Jesus appears in vision form, whether it's been in a dream, because I think the Ecstasy was in a dream, whether it's in a dream or in physical reality or in contemplation like it was for St. Catherine of Siena, it's always a life-changing, mystical experience. It's not, I just see the figure of Jesus outlined in like a piece of toast. It's more of I have seen and become Jesus in that sort of sense. Like he has enveloped me is a common term that's used in visions of Jesus. So when it comes to also Christ devotion, we have the Stations of the Cross. How many of you are familiar with the Stations of the Cross by chance? Half the room, actually. Okay. So the Stations of the Cross are a meditative ritualized practice. Now these are the Stations of the Cross in painting form. Jesus brought before Pilate, blah, 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 carries the cross, etc. Falls, someone else picks it up, things happen, he gets nailed, people barter over his garments, he's on the cross, he's taken down and then put into the sepulcher. How this is done is if you go into a Catholic church, and most Catholic churches have this, I'm actually surprised every time I walk into a Catholic church and it doesn't, but on the walls, you'll find the Stations of the Cross. And so one of the meditative practices that Catholics do is they go to each station, they contemplate that moment in Jesus' crucifixion, they pray specific prayers. These differ sometimes according to culture. They pray specific prayers and continue on to each station and do these. Now, it may be just in the church, which is really helpful. Sometimes it's in full physical form around like a hill. You'll find this in Europe a lot. Hills that have like grottos that are the representations of the Stations of the Cross. So people climb up these hills. When I was in Rome, I went to go visit the Spanish embassy and the hill up to the Spanish embassy has the Stations of the Cross along it. And they're beautiful representations. And in Jerusalem at the Via Crucis itself, the Way of the Cross, the Via Crucis, you can stop at the exact Stations of the Cross, and so it becomes an actual physical pilgrimage to the various stations and doing the contemplations and everything like that. So that is very core to Christ devotions. Marian devotions are a bit different. Nietzsche called them an effeminate response to a broken masculinity. I think Marian devotions are instead filling the need for goddess worship in a lot of ways. But not just goddess worship, they're filling the need. Basically, they help the Catholic Church in a lot of ways in the sense the Church views itself as mother and father to the world in a very mystical sense. So if Christ is the father figure, who is the mother figure? And so their physical representation of the mother figure is the Queen of Heaven, Mary. So as visions of Christ are important, visions of Mary have not been historically important until recently. Recently being in the last 500 centuries, because the Catholic Church, 2,000 years, recent is relative. Before, it was just, Christ showed up to me, Christ this, Christ showed up with Mary, but visions of Mary started becoming their own thing, where Christ wasn't there. The 3 main ones are Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Fatima, and Our Lady of Guadalupe. Now, these sanctuaries are awesome. Look at that. Fairy tale. And I've noticed also that Marian sanctuaries tend to be far more beautiful. Probably has to do with the whole, goddess worship sort of element attached to it. Much more motherly aspect. So, Our Lady of Lourdes, you'll find a common theme as I keep talking about them. Mary showed up to some country children and in a grotto in Lourdes, which is now inside this thing. In that grotto appeared in a crevice and basically, proclaimed love and beauty. love of Christ, practice this, practice that. Now, Our Lady of Lourdes was very important in developing the sort of like Marian traditions in Europe, because Marian traditions have already been established as being crucial in Latin America thanks to Our Lady of Guadalupe, which was actually one of the first modern Marian apparitions. But I start with Our Lady of Lourdes first because in the upper Western world, except in the Americas, we're probably more familiar with Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Lourdes is the central Marian apparition. Popes have gone to the statue of Our Lady of Lourdes and crowned it with like a full-on gold crown because, the Mother Christ appeared her, must crown the statue, etc. People have made pilgrimage there. It's become a major pilgrimage spot. The waters are believed to be healing. To contemplate there, as priests have said, is almost to contemplate within the very bosom of Mary. So it's viewed as a very crucial spot for this sort of for mystical contemplation. Our Lady of Fatima is the one I'm going to next. Our Lady of Fatima was also 3 country kids in the middle of a field. This time not in a grotto, but you always find it's some country bumpkin who sees Mary. Not to be insulting, but it is. Mary shows up here to these kids, and it gets crazy. Okay, so Our Lady of Fatima tells them the usual things. I love you, love Christ, love the church, etc., blah, 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 blah. And particularly places an emphasis, and you can see her holding one, places an emphasis on the rosary. And so usually now a Fatimite prayer is added into the rosary because of this apparition. The rosary was having a sort of decline before this moment, and then after it, now the rosary became a universal Catholic thing again, where everyone's just like, it's crucial to our practice as Catholics to pray the rosary. It became a meditative, prayer beads, basically. And I'll discuss the rosary as, just like the Stations of the Cross are important to Christ's devotions, the rosary is the crucial Marian devotion for sure. So kids go back, and people are like, whatever, we don't believe you. This is Portugal. People are a little bit more skeptical, I guess, than France. But, kids go back to Fatima, so what do? Bring them all onto a field and watch as I make the sun dance. Yeah, so what ends up happening is all these people, like 30,000 people, show up. Not all of them see it, but a large group of people end up seeing the sun change colors and dance in the fucking sky. And of course, psychologists have always been like, mass psychosis, whatever. But it was viewed as one of the great miracles, in a sense, of proving Our Lady of Fatima. And then Fatima further went another step and was just like, don't believe me? Here are some secrets that are things that are going to happen in the future. And so the 2 secrets that were revealed, they're easily found. They've kind of come true. The 3rd secret has slightly been revealed, but it's been kept secret by the Pope, traditionally. The latter half of the 3rd secret, because it was asked by Our Lady of Fatima, and the kids, they all became saints, of course, because once you see Jesus and Mary, fast track. But the kids, they kept these secrets, and, they would reveal them and everything like that, but only to the Pope. So it's always caused a whole bunch of conspiracy theorists to think that, Our Lady of Fatima prophesied what's known as Peter II, the last pope, or the church is going to explode when they physically explode, and all this other stuff. And it was also all tied to the Cold War, because one of the things that Our Lady of Fatima demanded was go out and convert the Russians. It didn't happen. This apparition didn't happen during the Cold War, but it ended up being somewhat impactful during the Cold War, and it kicked up Our Lady of Fatima's popularity amongst Catholics during the Cold War because they were just like, well, the only way to save us from nuclear annihilation is to convert the Russians. The sanctuary of Our Lady of Fatima is giant. It is actually the largest sanctuary, Marian sanctuary. And this area right here is actually where the apparition happened. A little chapel with still a little piece of grass and everything like that there. And, main chapel here. And people gather here in large numbers in remembrance of, her feast day and what have you. And that is in Portugal. Actually, the Byzantine Catholic Church that I went to with Brother Kim last night, is named Our Lady of Fatima. And now, keep in mind also, Byzantine Catholics are Russian Orthodox that have become Catholic. So, of course, Our Lady of Fatima might be a little bit important to them, especially considering her message of Russians converting. So, if you ever get the chance, keep an eye out for the beautiful Russian-style icons of Our Lady of Fatima. Now we're going to go on to Our Lady of Guadalupe. So this is the Grand Basilica. This is the old one. People just go in there to contemplate. The actual thing is in here because this is, besides the Holy Land in Rome, the largest pilgrimage site on the face of the planet. When it comes to Catholicism, of course, Mecca always rivals. In there is kept the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Juan Diego, country bumpkin, he was a native fella, went up to the hill of Tepeyac, which was where Tenochtitlan, the old Aztec goddess, used to be. And he was having a moment of faith conflict or whatever, and out appeared Our Lady of Guadalupe, and around him, while he was kneeling in adoration, roses all sprouted. She was just like, take these roses over to the Archbishop and tell them that I have appeared and that I am your mother. I'm the mother of the Americas, and I fight specifically for you, the downtrodden and the natives of this land, which revolutionary message in Spanish conquistador Mexico. So, of course, he shows up to the Archbishop, and they're like, bullshit, blah, 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 and he takes the roses. He's like, she asked me to bring these roses. They don't grow in this season. And he unravels, and the roses fall out, but the roses have transformed his cloak into an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, as the legend goes. Modern tales, very likely a study, believe that it might have been painted by a native painter, but there's no conclusive evidence either way. But it was changing. Like, it changed the church completely, because Marian devotions became not just some sort of mystical thing here and there, but someone actually saw Mary and it became major, and conversion to Catholicism kicked up by about 80% in Spanish-controlled America at that time. Of course, that leads to a little bit of suspicion, but at the same time, now what this means is that Latin American Catholics are heavily all about Marian adorations and Marian devotions. There's the Our Lady of Guadalupe right there. Clothed in the night sky, usually sometimes represented with a crown of stars, no longer really exists in modern images, and a crescent moon being held up by an unpleasant-looking seraph right there. This is also the image that is presented, and I won't go into this because this is an entire other talk, but in Canaanite mythology, this is also the image represented for Asherah, and exactly with her own title as Queen of Heaven, Mother of all. So it's interesting that Our Lady of Guadalupe, the first Marian apparition, looks exactly as Asherah is described in the cycle of Baal Hadad. So yeah, and that's Juan Diego there, putting the roses into his cloak, which would later become this image. That Marian apparition basically kicked off all the other Marian apparitions. And so let's discuss the Rosary, how to pray the Rosary. You see the Rosary, you start at the cross, you actually don't finish at the cross, you finish once you end with the mysteries. So you pray the glorious mysteries, the joyful mysteries, the sorrowful mysteries, and the luminous mysteries, depending on the day, sometimes traditionally. Glorious mysteries, Sunday, Wednesday, they're the resurrection, the ascension, the descent of the Holy Spirit, the assumption, and the crowning of Our Lady. Joyful mysteries, the Annunciation, the visitation, the birth of our Lord, the presentation in the temple, and the finding of Jesus in the temple that one time he ran away. That's Monday and Saturday. Sorrowful mysteries, Tuesday and Friday, agony in the garden, the scourging of the pillar, the crowning with thorns, the carrying of the cross, and the crucifixion. And then the luminous mysteries, the baptism in the Jordan, the wedding feast of Cana, the proclamation of the kingdom of God, the transfiguration, and the institution of the Eucharist. So you make the sign of the cross, you say the Apostles' Creed, you do an Our Father, then you say 3 Hail Marys, you do an Our Father, then you're like the beginning of the glorious mysteries, you proclaim it to yourself. Or if you're doing it as a group, sometimes you'll show up before Mass, and you'll see the old ladies there all together, just sort of in a very mystical service that's all in unison, proclaiming the mystery together and like saying the Hail Marys. And it's a very meditative thing. It's like chanting, like Om, and, yeah, Waheguru, stuff like that. Or even sometimes when we do the Resh together, in that sort of sense. There's a certain mystical element where you're doing it together, but it's meant to be done mostly alone and to contemplate the mysteries as you do it. You can find this image anywhere, and rosaries come in all shapes and sizes. You can probably walk into any Catholic church and they'll have a rosary to give you or sent to you. So this is the main element of conducting Marian devotion, which is the rosary. My mother, who considers herself a Catholic, and somewhat Catholic Buddhist really, she does the rosary every day, but has not been to a Mass in like 10 years. That should say a lot about the importance of Marian devotion, especially when it comes to the mystical aspects of Catholicism. I'm going to give you a choice here. Do you want to hear about the folk saints first, the magical saints, or actually do you want to hear about the folk saints or the magical saints? Magical saints? Oh, yeah. All right. I should have guessed. All right. So if we're going to talk about magical saints, we need to talk about technically the man of the hour when it comes to magical saints nowadays, which is, here you go, Saint Cyprian. Who is familiar with Saint Cyprian? So Saint Cyprian his whole saint story was, he was a pagan magician. Some Christian lady was having some trouble. He was hired to further harass her, further realize that this was a bad idea, cast out the demon that he had summoned. He was also some necromancer, so probably some skeleton thing he had summoned. And then converted to Christianity and used his power of magic for good. And this persisted in especially European Catholicism and later on in sort of root work and stuff like that. So especially around African American Catholics and stuff like that. That Saint Cyprian was the saint that you meditated on, advocated to, if you needed help with anything magical, anything outside of the ordinary realm of other saints. And so, known as a patron saint of magicians, necromancers unofficially, but officially the patron saint of recusant magicians, people who have decided not to become magicians anymore, or use their powers for evil. So he's also viewed as righteous advocate, officially. Cyprian no longer is considered as part of the martyrology, which is the schedule of saints in the Catholic Church, unless you follow the pre-Vatican II one, in which case he's still there. That's because there is not enough evidence for the Catholic Church to say that he existed, and post-Vatican II that became very important to the Church to remove all those saints that might not be real. So to get them more reputation in the world, so to speak. Well, Saint Cyprian stuck around, especially when people wanted to write texts, magical texts. They always attributed to Saint Cyprian. San Cipriano, very popular in Portugal and Brazil nowadays. And recently, there was a root worker, I think his name is Brother Ali. On the internet, you can find his work. He basically revived Saint Cyprian's cult in magical communities across the world just by producing this text of Saint Cyprian magic and oils and stuff like that. And now it's huge. I've traveled to different bodies of the O.T.O, and I've at least met one person who is devoted to Saint Cyprian. And in New Mexico, I found a painting in a friend's bedroom that they had done as Saint Cyprian because they were now devoted to him. There's a brother in Dallas who's a good friend of mine who is an expert on Saint Cyprian. It's just all over the place now. Besides Saint Cyprian, another example I want to give is Saint Martin de Porres. Saint Martin de Porres in particular is interesting to me because, like me, I was born in Panama. His mother was Panamanian. So I saw his statue all the time growing up, and actually grew up with a statue of him right next to my bed. St. Martin de Porres is evoked by, especially in Latin America, by people involved in Latin American esotericism and occultism. So he's the patron of African diasporic folk, like me, and of mixed race folk, like me, and of social justice. And so, we were talking about, how there is a certain strain of liberation theology. People who are into the magical arts and liberation theology are super into St. Martin de Porres. And so he was claimed to do a bunch of awesome things. He was able to levitate, bilocate, had miraculous knowledge, which means he would know about things that no one should know about. Instant healing, sometimes by winking at people, which is really cheeky. And had the power of animal communication. This is one of the mysteries that is attributed to him. Basically, he had shown up at his monastery and a whole bunch of monks were trying to run out these animals that were in there. And, the monks usually keep a dog or a cat or something. And, but he was just no, let them all feed. And it's but we only have one plate for them. And it's our image is animals will not eat from the same plate. But he talked to them accordingly, apparently, in some sort of sing-song foreign language. And they all gathered and ate, and then promptly bowed to him afterwards and left. So that's usually the mystery that's represented on his iconography.
What's the broom?
What?
Is it a broom?
Oh yeah, because he was a monk, and so he enjoyed cleaning and sweeping. Yeah, so he's usually represented with a broom, and usually when magical things are done, like he's invoked in magical ceremonies, they're usually holding a broom, to invoke him. He's particularly has influence. He's so important to esotericism in Latin America that he's even gained a place himself as an Orisha in Santeria, where he's known as Papa Candelo, because one of the things he was able to do is burst out in spontaneous fire all around him while adoring the Eucharist. And so the idea of spontaneous fire bursting when adoring the Eucharist is viewed as like the fire of God has made itself manifest. Yeah. And so Papa Candelo, which means daddy candle, as a sort of cheeky reference to the fire thing, is an Orisha in Santeria. He's earned himself a place in that pantheon, and is also known as Papa Candelo even by Catholic esotericists who practice with him. Onwards to one of my favorite stories of saints that have randomly become associated with the magical arts is Saint Expeditus, or Saint Expedite. Saint Expedite is usually represented like this, holding a martyr's wreath and everything. So right here is a crow that's saying cross, which means later. And so it's because of his name, he became associated with the whole idea of just like, if we want something done fast, we must call on Saint Expedite. And the crow he's stepping on is procrastination made manifest. And so Saint Expeditus is really big in Louisiana and other foreign lands, usually French. It's really big on the island of Réunion, where his cult is gigantic, and they have like grottos dedicated to Saint Expedite. So I say he's humorous because there might have never been a Saint Expedite by that name, because his name likely comes from the fact that as the church was shipping various saint images to the New World and statues, they wanted them to arrive fast. So on the outside of the box, Expedite. And so they were just like, oh shit, priests would get these saints and be like, who is this? And it's like, oh, clearly this is Saint Expedite. It says it on the front of the Bible. Now this is just legend, and a history has developed around Saint Expedite as being like some martyr from Armenia. But I'm very inclined to believe that's likely what happened, mostly because there's not really all that recorded history about Saint Expedite. But he is adopted as a saint in the Catholic Church, probably because they want to cover their own asses. But Saint Expeditus is invoked, as I said, for fast action, getting things done, beating procrastination. And if you need a magical action done immediately, if you're tired of waiting, this is your man. If you need to get somewhere fast on a pilgrimage, that's who you call. If you're hungry and you need food, if you need money to come into you, if you need a home, change in your life, what have you, Saint Expedite will crush on that crow for you, metaphorically. And so sometimes magical ceremonies involve a representation of a crow that you step on in favor of Saint Expedite. You don't step on an actual crow, don't worry. But yes, probably one of the best places to learn about the cult of Saint Expedite here in the U.S. would be Louisiana. Visit New Orleans, and everyone knows about Saint Expedite, and they call upon him heavily. His cult spread to France, and they have Saint Expedite saint cults over there. The last magical saint there's actually two more. The last singular magical saint I want to talk about, because the other one is a group of saints, is Saint Jude Thaddeus the Apostle. I probably listed him under, San Judas Tadeo. Okay, so Saint Jude Thaddeus looks like this. This is a very modern representation where he looks super handsome. But he has a flame above his head representing that he was one of the apostles. There he holds his medallion and his staff. Now, why would an apostle, out of all the apostles, become such a magical saint? Well, the thing is, they have to challenge, especially in Mexico, there's a certain challenge to the Catholic Church known as Santa Muerte, and we'll go into that when we talk about the folk saints. But who knows here what St. Jude is the patron saint of?
Hopeless cases.
Hopeless cases and lost causes. So also, because of that, patron saint of also criminals and policemen, because on either side it's a lost cause. Yeah. And so that's this main sanctuary. It's actually St. Hippolytus Church. But as the cult of St. Jude Thaddeus grew in Mexico, they moved his images to the main altar. And so poor St. Hippolytus got moved to the side. And that is the major pilgrimage point of St. Thaddeus in the world. Mexicans absolutely love this man, and he is invoked in magical practice all over the place in Mexico. In my own Texas, he's very huge as well because border regions. And probably here in Southern California, you'll find a lot of St. Jude Thaddeus sort of stuff. Patron saint of lost causes, hopeless causes, etc. So you'll find him invoked when things have, like when shit has hit the fan, is when St. Jude Thaddeus is invoked. People leave coins there, it's the belief that you can bribe him. This came out of the idea that, so criminals are really into him, because representations of St. Jude Thaddeus were fucked up at some factory back in the day. This is all truth. We were fucked up in some factory back in the day, and he wasn't holding his staff in his right hand, but in his left hand. And so the criminals were just like, the sinister hand. So maybe he can help us as we conduct our sinister causes. And so, there's the belief that St. Jude Thaddeus can be bribed and all this other stuff. So people throw coins at his statue or adorn him in beads, as you see there, and so forth. Now, the pilgrimage that happens there is gigantic. It is a festival on October 28th at St. Hippolytus of 100,000 people that show up at one time. And there are 12 masses that happen throughout the day. And sometimes people will show up, like you'll see the big mob bosses show up in their limousines, and they'll greet the people, and they'll give them statues of St. Jude and medallions, and because of his own medallion and everything. But they'll also you also see the police chief like right in the front row in the front pew, sitting next to the mob boss, because it is the day of truce. You don't fuck with the day of St. Jude in Mexico. To betray that sort of peace is to insult the saint. And, you don't want that magical badness on you to have like a saint turn on you because you betrayed this sort of peace. So yeah, that's St. Jude. The next magical saints are actually a group of saints, and they will be particularly interesting to us as Thelemites because they are known as the Phallic Saints. That doesn't mean that they're shown with a gigantic cock, of course, but are invoked for fertility. They've been invoked for fertility since ancient times, when the saints first start becoming a thing. Our own Richard Payne Knight, a name that sounds familiar to a lot of Thelemites, I hope. Richard Payne Knight reported on them and wrote on them in his own text on, phallic worship, and talked about the penis effigies that were particularly offered to Cosmas and Damian, duo saints who were physicians. So people would leave effigies of what they wanted to be healed at the altars of Cosmas and Damian. And they found, Richard Payne Knight figured out that they left a whole lot of penis effigies. Cure erectile dysfunction or what have you. And so Cosmas and Damian ended up becoming the top phallic saints. Now, why did I include a picture of this poor saint's pierced feet? Well, Saint Guenel in France is a phallic saint, and the way they venerate him is that teenage girls, so that they will find their loved one, like their promised one, will go and pierce poor Saint Guenel's feet. And this refers to some practice, some magical practice that is long forgotten, but is still continued, where the feet of phallic saints are pierced continuously with the hope that this will make the saint actually provide them with what they need, whether it's to conceive or to find their eternal love, what have you. But it's a fascinating magical practice that even scholars of medieval times have no idea why it's been happening. There's a lot of speculation, of course, but I recommend folks do a lot of research in phallic saints. There are 25 to 30 phallic saints, and there's new ones popping up all the time in different parts of the world. So, okay, so let's talk about the folk saints real quick before we enter into pilgrimages and a quick run through of some mystical elements, and I'll make some suggestions of people you should look into in books. Okay, so when it comes to folk saints we must recognize are not recognized by the church in any single way, and sometimes they even fight against them. Folk saints deal a lot with people. The original saints were not ones prescribed by the church. They were ones that just popped up in an area, and people were just like, oh yeah, this guy's a saint. Obviously, let's just, venerate him as a saint. Now, the church has kind of tried to put a stop to this, in particular because folk saints are kind of strange nowadays. Now, if I read these words to you, you may not believe who they are being said about, and I'll remove the name. So here's a few quotes. It's like he is alive and with us, like a friend. He's kind of like a Virgin Mary for us. We say, blank, help us with our work or with this planting, and it always goes well. Nuns also took pieces of his hair as relics when he lay dead. And here's a couple other quotes. We have a faith, a confidence in him. When I go to bed and when I wake up, I first pray to God and then I pray to him. And then everything is all right. His presence is here always as a positive force. I feel it in my skin. I have faith that always, at all times, he has an eye on us. It's as if the dead saint looks on his killers and forgives them, and upon the world proclaiming that he who dies for an idea is beyond suffering. Does anyone want to guess who I'm talking about? I'm talking about San Ernesto de la Higuera.
Oh, wow.
As he is known in Bolivia, he is Saint Ernesto of the Higuera.
Oh, my.
And that is one of the top pilgrimages spots in Latin America. Che Guevara. Ernesto Che Guevara, San Ernesto de la Higuera. And La Higuera is the spot where he was killed, which is that spot. And, it says, your example illuminates a new dawn for us. But yeah, that is one of the major shrines in folk Catholicism. The laundry place where Guevara's corpse was actually displayed to the world's press in Valle Grande is now a place of pilgrimage as well, with hundreds of personal messages transcribed and carved into the surrounding walls by, admiring visitors, and crosses and images are left and petitions are left for El Che. In large letters above the table where Che's body once lay, an engraving now reads in the most saintly sort of writing, "None dies as long as he is remembered." And I placed him as the first folk saint I wanted to talk about because that is the definition of a folk saint. If someone has done enough to be remembered and venerated in such a sense, they become a folk saint, and they never die to these people. And Che, you can get prayer cards of Che in Bolivia, where the main cult of San Ernesto exists, and to this day. And the nuns did take pieces of his hair as relic. And I don't have it here, I believe, but definitely take a look at images of the dead Che. And as our own CIA head here at the time said, the stupid mistake the Bolivians have made is to kill the Che. Now he will be immortal. So that actually ended up happening for the Bolivians, who view him as a very important folk saint. Now let's go from there, from a folk saint who was a man of death in his life, to Santa Muerte. Santa Muerte is not just, as popular opinion has it, venerated in Mexico. That's the central shrine to Santa Muerte in Mexico City. But it's also venerated as El Rey Pascual, the Easter King, which is a creepy name to give death. And Saint La Muerte, Saint the Death. That's how he's worshipped venerated in Argentina. So Santa Muerte de Pito, which is this one right here, dressed as a bride and wears hundreds of pieces of gold jewelry given by the faithful to show gratitude for favors received or to ask for one. The celebration that they have for Santa Muerte officially begins at the stroke of midnight on November 1st. About 5,000 faithful turn out to pray the Rosary, which they have a special Rosary actually for Santa Muerte. It's a subsuming of the Marian practices into Santa Muerte. For purification, instead of incense, there is the smoke of marijuana. Flowers, pan de muerto, which is a specialized bread for Day of the Dead. Sweets and candy skulls are amongst other things that can be seen at the ceremony. Foods such as cake, chicken with mole, hot chocolate, coffee, and atole are served, so it's a great ceremony. Mariachis and marimba bands play heavily throughout the whole procession. Santa Muerte Rosary is particularly invoked, and Santa Muerte is almost uniquely invoked for almost all LGBT weddings in Mexico. In Mexico, it's viewed as female, Santa. In Argentina, it's viewed as male, and in Guatemala, where El Rey Pascual is viewed as male as well. So only Mexico views it as female. But that Mexico is also tied almost 75-25 in the cult of Santa Muerte. 75 view her as a folk saint, 25 view her as a separate goddess, and have broken away completely from the Catholic Church. So while a separate church exists now in Mexico, it's still very Catholic in its rituals and appearances, and is definitely 100% still Catholic in Guatemala and in Argentina. The next folk saint to talk about, and definitely do more research on Santa Muerte, because it is wild and is one of the world's fastest growing religions. Worshipping death has always been popular amongst humans. The next one I want to talk about is actually what's known as a narco saint. Narco saint is Sous Malverde, and his main shrine site is in Sinaloa, which is the center of the cartels. Jesus Malverde is this fellow right here. I like how in all these shrines there's always a, hey, please give some money so we can keep up this shrine. You see all these pictures put up there. Jesus Malverde probably also never existed, but he is the top narco saints. There are other minor narco saints. And his whole idea was that he was a Robin Hood type narco trafficking figure in the 1800s, early 1900s. And he is heavily evoked by, in particular, the cartels. Because what better image is there for them than a folk saint of a narco trafficking? And so they invoke him a lot. He's very much a part of underground criminal culture in Mexico, or just fuck you to the authorities culture of Mexico. Mm-hmm. His main feast day is the 3rd of May, where a large, wild party happens that causes property destruction and is, of course, condemned heavily by the Catholic Church and all sorts of goodness. On to the next saint, since we're moving a little bit fast here, is Saint Cyril Akali. Who's familiar with Saint Cyril Akali by chance? No one. Very interesting. Saint Cyril Akali is the patron saint of the Roma people. Now, Saint Cyril Akali, Lakali means the black. As you can see, it's represented as a black woman. And Saint Cyril Akali, while being patron saint of the Romani people, actually, probably also never existed. But this particular veneration is actually encouraged by the Catholic Church, because in old times, when the church tried to stop this tradition, so there's a main pilgrimage that happens. It's the largest gathering of the Roma in the world. On May 24th, where they show up at Sainte-Marie de la Mer, the coast of Brittany in France. And the main thing that happens there is they go, they venerate, they bring the statue out, bring her into the waters, blah, blah, blah. Legend is that Lazarus and his family, biblical Lazarus, arrived in France after fleeing persecutions of early Christians and took with them their black Egyptian handmaiden. And that's Saint Cyril Akali. Saint Cyril Akali was known to give alms to the poor, and that is a very important practice to the Roma, and therefore the Roma fell in love with Saint Cyril Akali. So imagine the Catholic Church trying to stop hundreds of thousands of Roma from doing their thing at a ritual ceremony. They tried for hundreds of years and just basically gave up, and basically were just like, the priests now are part of the ceremony there. And they're just like, oh yeah, of course, venerate this statue of Saint Cyril, whatever. Not an official saint in any way of the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church is just like, just let them do their thing. It's better this than whatever else could happen. Now, the Lakali part is because Kali in Old Vedic was also tied to the color black. And it's very much believed by modern religious studies scholars that Saint Sara is Kali, but reborn into a Catholic standpoint. The Catholic Church is smart. It knows when to grab other gods and make them work for them. So the next one is Don Pedro Jaramillo. This is actually only 2 hours away from my house. Don Pedro Jaramillo was known as the real chief of the curanderos. Curandero being a deep tradition within folk Catholicism in Latin America, which is the belief of the medicine man, basically, who is able to heal people through his knowledge of herbs and different mysterious substances, and especially because he was a good Catholic. And so this is deep into folk Catholicism. Don Pedro Jaramillo was the top curandero of all time, as he's viewed. His shrine, this is his shrine right here, that's his tomb right there, and that's a statue, and of course, we see the little box with the American flag, that's where you give your money, of course. This is in Falfurrias, Texas, a little bit south of San Antonio and a little bit west of Corpus Christi in Texas, and I'm planning to gather some folks to go head over there, but had a great reputation in life of training curanderos and teaching them his own mysteries, and is the only folk saint to have a government-sponsored and cared-for shrine, because he was very crucial to the region historically, and so the Texas Historical Societies and everything like that, they have the only historical marker that is dual language in Texas is at his shrine. So that's all the saints I wanted to mention. Definitely look into, there's a wide variety of other magical saints, but I wanted to give you some examples and a whole bunch of other folk saints. So definitely do some research with them, and you might even be able to work with them in regards to ritual and magic or what have you, and see how they've come together. The magical saints in particular work heavily with the grimoire tradition, and I'll be going into that after I talk about these pilgrimages real quick. So 3 main pilgrimages in the Catholic Church. The Holy Land. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Jesus was crucified and buried there, resurrected, etc. So, of course, the central shrine of Christianity. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not only shared by Catholics, but shared by 6 other of the old traditional churches, including the Ethiopians who are able to use the rooftop. Then there's also the Church of the Nativity, where Jesus was born, Church of the Annunciation, where he was announced, Church of Transfiguration, where he went on the hilltop and did one of the great mysteries of Christ and was able to like triplicate himself and turn himself divine and show himself to the prophets and everything. Praised moment, but it's in the New Testament. You can look it up there. Bethany beyond the Jordan, which is where Jesus was believed to be baptized. Christians go there to engage in baptism again in the very waters where Jesus was baptized. The Galilean Jesus Trail, which goes along the different spots in Galilee where Jesus did things, including walk on water, famously. So after that is, of course, you go to Rome. The image I'm going to use is when I made my own trip to Rome. I scaled the Scala Sancta. These are believed to be the stairs that Pontius Pilate, that Jesus had to crawl up on his knees to go see Pontius Pilate. So now, as part of indulgence, I like to say to my Catholic friends that my sins have been forgiven for like the next 90 years because I've done all these pilgrimages and they haven't. And so I've cheated them into my own salvation. But you get like, I think 9 years or something like that for doing these. The Scala Sancta were particularly important because they lead up to what was then known as the Sanctum Sanctorum. For any fans of Marvel Comics, that name is very familiar. But the Sanctum Sanctorum was the personal chapel of the popes, and there was kept various relics and images of Christ. It was viewed as one of the most sacred centers. Now, of course, the Sanctum Sanctorum is St. Peter's Basilica. But back then, these stairs led to there. The stairs are still there, and they lead to this beautiful chapel, but it's no longer the Sanctum Sanctorum. And so in Rome, you do the 7 pilgrim churches. That's St. Peter's, St. Paul's outside the wall, where St. Paul is buried, St. John Lateran, which is the personal church of the Pope, gorgeous, St. Mary Major, a whole bunch of relics there, St. Lawrence outside the wall, a whole bunch of relics there, Holy Cross in Jerusalem, which is where Emperor Constantine's mother supposedly brought the true cross and all this bunch of other stuff and placed it there, and St. Sebastian outside the walls. And then besides that is the Way of St. James, which is the pilgrimage I most want to do. That is Santiago de Compostela in Galicia in Spain. That is where St. James the Apostle is believed to be buried. The apostles all spread to different parts of the world. St. James went over to Spain. The pilgrimage is thought to be done traditionally from either Notre Dame in Paris or Canterbury in England. And you walk or you take a boat or a horse the entire way to Santiago de Compostela. And people still do this. It's become very popular, especially amongst secular sort of like hikers, because it's a path that's been established for now 1,000 years, so why not? And there's a really nice movie called The Way about it's actually really good in explaining how the pilgrimage affects people and what it is. And one of the best movies I've seen about like the mystical idea of pilgrimage and contemplation and everything. But the idea is to go there. Once you go there, they'll give you a certificate. It's just like, you did it, yeah, sins forgiven for insert years here. And one of the coolest things in there is they have a huge incenser that swings from one end of Santiago de Compostela to the other. And you're greeted there with great ceremony. They're like, welcome pilgrims, you did it. So yeah, those are the 3 main pilgrimages. Of course, there's a bunch of minor ones, but those are the 3 major ones in Roman Catholicism. Let's get into some quick, deep shit here. When it comes to Catholic mysticism, it's viewed as being on a threefold path. There's the body purgative path, soma. There is the soul illuminative path, psyche. And the spirit unitive path, pneuma. So body purgative means, like not just fighting against lust and, gluttony or what have you, but also kneeling in prayer and supplication, doing the signs of the cross, things that involve your body. Soul illuminative is the contemplation, entering in true contemplation and meditation and trying to illuminate yourself as to the mysteries. And study of the sacred scripture is important in this section. And spirit unitive, which is where you enter into spiritual acts of deep contemplation or spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, where you go through a specific path to bring yourself in closer union to God, to Godhood. The types of meditation are known as apophatic, which is the silence of God, what God isn't. And cataphatic, the imagination of God, what God is. Those are the types of meditation one can take. So, for example, the silence of God would be Miguel de Molinos sort of type, silent contemplation, not speaking, not really imagining anything, just entering into that Zen meditative state. And then the cataphatic imagination of God is more of stuff like the spiritual exercises. Think of what God is, what God provides, what God can do, what you can do united with God. And of course, other elements of mysticism. We already talked about the mystical marriage, so I'm not going to go into that much. And the ecstasy and the visions and the physical transformations. And of course, I don't need to mention miracles to you all. I mean, we're told about miracles of saints in everyday society, or some random evangelical claiming he healed someone of cancer, what have you. But that's viewed as also being a manifestation of one's closer unity to God, to the Trinity. Now, one of the ways that cataphatic meditation is done is through the liturgy of the hours. The liturgy of the hours are something that I actually believe should exist in Thelema in some way or another. So that's matins at night, lauds at dawn, prime at early morning, terce at mid-morning, sect at noon, noon at mid-afternoon, vespers at dusk, my favorite vespers, and compline in the early evening. And what it is technically Catholics should be doing these prayers 7 times a day. However, we're lazy. And people generally don't do their prayers when they're asked to. There's some monks being hardcore, though, and doing, I think, the compline. What it is, it's involved with a lot of singing and prayer together and, actions and ceremony and etc. And so these are rites and rituals that are outside the central Mass. Now, why do I mention this in particular when it comes to Thelema? Because I think that the EGC would benefit from having, some of these outside rites that don't conflict or replace the Mass in any way. Definitely look, if you can, get yourself a copy of, probably get a PDF copy of the Liturgy of the Hours, known usually as the Divine Hours. If you get the chance, go to a Catholic church when they're doing Vespers. Incredible stuff. And they're not just the Liturgy of the Hours, but there are various liturgies that exist, especially in the Eastern Catholic churches. In particular, with Brother Kim, we went to a liturgy. It was a pre-sanctified. What was the exact name of it?
Liturgy of the Pre-Sanctified Gifts?
Yeah, the Liturgy of the Pre-Sanctified Gifts. And so it had its own elements of prayer. It wasn't a Mass, but it was its own separate moment of adoration, united, mystical gathering. It's fairly important in the sort of cataphatic meditation that Catholics do to bring themselves in greater union. So there's also the Grimoire tradition. To discuss the Grimoire tradition, I'm going to bring up a picture of everyone's favorite magical homeboy, Hermes Trismegistus. If I told you this was in a Catholic cathedral, most of the time you wouldn't believe me, but this is actually at the very entrance of the Duomo in Siena. So the Duomo in Siena, when you enter the main doors, has this, and it's Hermes Trismegistus handing the law and magical teachings to the Egyptians. And it says, Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus. Mercury, of course, Hermes, Contemporaneous Moise, which Catholics believed, especially in the Renaissance, and probably still do now, if they even know about Hermes, is they believed he was a prophet contemporary to Moses. And that at that time was teaching Hermeticism, which a lot of Catholics view as being, if Christianized, viewed as being completely in line with Christianity and being a predecessor to Christianity in a lot of ways. So he received a place of high veneration, especially in Renaissance Catholicism. This all came from the fact that when people wanted to attribute their grimoires in medieval times, sometimes if it wasn't Pope Honorius writing about battling demons, which is also super cool, the Grimoire Pope Honorius, the legend behind that was that Pope Honorius, as a spiritual exercise, would summon demons, argue with them, and banish them. They were attributed to Hermes. Hermes Trismegistus, or Saint Hermes, or Saint Trismegistus, Saint Mercurius, whichever, or all three names. And so this particular, once people started trying to figure out who was Hermes Trismegistus, and the great Hermetic texts start showing up in Renaissance times, the Emerald Tablet and stuff like that, a man by the name of Giovanni Piccolo della Mirandola wrote the Apologia, which first he wrote a whole bunch of theses, and a whole bunch of Catholics were like, oh, heresy. And then he wrote the Apologia, basically being like, look, it's not heresy. Here's why. And so he goes into big elements of it. But the most important thing there is he established in formality the Catholic theory of magic. That is that there are two types of magic, which are theurgy, divine magic, and he counted the Mass as being part of theurgy. Theurgy also when we work with the angels and the saints. And then there's Goetia, which is demonic magic, which we as Catholics have the power, especially if one is a clergy member, is Giovanni Piccolo della Mirandola argued, because Christ gave Peter the keys of heaven. Technically, demons can do nothing to us except serve us. So that's, he believed Goetia was just a fine kind of magic, but one needed to be careful with it. These disciplines were explained as the operation of the stars. The operation of the stars is theurgy and Goetia, just as alchemy was known as the operation of the sun. Astrology became known as the operation of the moon. As such, this helped develop the Catholic theory of magic, which helped kick off Renaissance Christian Hermeticism. That's a quick overview of mysticism. To go into Catholic mysticism requires 2,000 years of study, which they have done it themselves. But there are a bunch of books and names I can recommend, which is what I'm going to do now as the ending portion. I recommend The Cloud of Unknowing. It was an anonymous text in the Middle Ages that heavily spoke about these great mystical elements for the first time in a united text. Before it was sort of oral Christian tradition. Now it was sort of put into a text, and The Cloud of the Unknowing is very much about the idea that it is better not to know God. And this wasn't viewed as heretical by the Catholic Church because they say it all the time. Remember, one of the big elements of Catholic meditation is the silence of God, imagining, not even imagining God. And so Cloud of the Unknowing is talking about how the physical cloud of the unknown, metaphysical cloud of the unknowing is better than seeing the face of God. There's the Book of the 24 Philosophers, in which 24 philosophers give 24 statements about what God is. So this is the exact opposite of the Cloud of the Unknowing. In particular, the second definition gained wide currency from early on in the Middle Ages and was actually used by Crowley. God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Does that sound familiar? And in Latin, Deus est sphera infinita quis centrum e ubique circumferentia nusquam. And it became so central to mystical belief that even Catholic magicians and Hermeticists would quote it before beginning their operations. So no doubt that's why it had such an influence on Crowley. Julian of Norwich and the Revelations of Divine Love, in which you have a woman for the first time writing a hardcore mystical text of Catholicism in which she had revelations and mysteries revealed to her in visions and dreams, and wrote about them in Revelations of Divine Love. There's Ignatius Loyola and the Spiritual Exercises, which Crowley considered a high form of yoga. He wrote Liber Astarte as his own Thelemic version of spiritual exercises. Now, I still recommend looking at the spiritual exercises because I think they can be modified for use today, and that's not just the former Jesuit in me talking. Thomas à Kempis and the Imitation of Christ. The Imitation of Christ is, next to the Bible in the Catholic Church, the most important work. The most important book, bar none. Most popes have said this since its publication, and it is viewed as the Bible being the sacred scripture. Here is a mystical interpretation of everything you've just read. And so the Imitation of Christ is very important. Swami Vivekananda carried it always with him, and the Gita. There are actually pictures of him just holding those two books, because he viewed the Imitation of Christ to be one of the most important mystical works of all time. And Vivekananda is particularly very important to us, because we study his works on yoga. If you look at the AA reading list, he is on there. Raja Yoga.
Wait, you said who was always seen carrying these?
Swami Vivekananda.
Okay.
Yeah. And Nietzsche referred to the Imitation, our own Saint Nietzsche, always complaining about things, referred to the Imitation of Christ as one of those books which I cannot hold in my hand without a physiological reaction. It exudes a perfume of the eternal feminine, which is strictly for Frenchmen or Wagnerians. He hated the book, of course. And of course, St. John of the Cross, one of the most important mystical saints in the Catholic Church. He created the dark night of the sense and the dark night of the soul. So the idea was, in order to truly know God and to ascend into this transfiguration of oneself into the Godhood that is Christ, one needed to have a dark night of the sense in which you basically destroyed in meditation your senses. They become useless to you. He would probably really enjoy sensory deprivation tanks. And the dark night of the soul, which is the idea that after you've done that and you've gained like a little bit of a glimpse of God, you are going to be ripped away. But don't let that stop you, because you should continue to seek the Godhood and the light of God. And so the dark night of the soul was this idea of you're going to be in darkness, and that's awesome. It's kind of brutal, it's metal, but it's just like you're going to feel horrible and you're going to hate yourself, and that's the best part about it, because this is how you should be, in the sense that you will suffer, and you must know that in order to achieve any sort of perfection, one must suffer. That was the big lesson there. And so Dark Night of the Soul eventually leading to when you would take the 10 steps. Look into his works. They're very mystical and very applicable to different senses. You would take the 10 steps that would lead you into the central point of Godhood, of unity with Christ. Now we'll go into the 3 modern works here. I have copies of the one I'm going to talk about right now. Meditations on the Tarot is believed to be now the central work of Catholic esotericism, bar none. As you can see at the bottom, it is a journey into Christian Hermeticism, written by an occultist who converted and became a Catholic. He explored the tarot and viewed the tarot as one of the most important works of meditation one could use in glimpsing the mysteries of the Catholic Church. It is written in a very praiseworthy sort of way. Secular scholars have said that it should be considered one of the great books of history. It is beloved. In particular, it was a favorite of Pope John Paul II. Those 2 volumes you see right there are Meditations on the Tarot. It's fairly modern, early 1900s, but if you really want to understand, for us as practitioners and studiers of magic, Meditations on the Tarot is probably the most accessible work for us to understand Catholic mysteries. And then after that is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was also a contemporary around this time and was a Jesuit who was also an evolutionary biologist. And as an evolutionary biologist, he believed that as we evolve physically throughout human history, we also evolve spiritually. And that one day we will evolve to the point of not knowing God at start and then becoming the Omega point, as he called it. Now, he's known as unofficially the patron saint of transhumanism because the Omega point was the first description anyone could see of the singularity. And so he also is known as a patron saint of the internet because he believed that the next point of evolution after he would die, of spiritual evolution, was that we would develop the new sphere. And the new sphere would envelop the world, and it would be a quick interchange of information and knowledge as if we were accessing the very Akashic records themselves. And so students of Teilhard de Chardin believe that, he predicted the internet. But, and he has this great quote here: someday after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, because he was a scientist, he believed that we should definitely master all these things and be deep into the sciences. We shall harness for God the energies of love, and then for a second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire. And very deep a mystic. I recommend his work in particular, The Phenomenon of Man, which is this work here. And feel free to come and flip through it after I'm done with the talk. And finally is Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton was the last great modern mystic to be acknowledged by most of the church. Here he is with a young fellow who's also another modern mystic, the Dalai Lama. Thomas Merton famously was recently brought up, like the first official blessing of people loving Thomas Merton was Pope Francis when he came to speak to Congress, mentioned Thomas Merton. He wrote an autobiography which actually increased people entering into a monastic life by 85% in the span of just immediately after its publishing. And I actually had a copy of his books when I went into the seminary.
It's a 7-story mountain.
7-story mountain, correct. Thomas Merton believed and was very influential in this aspect of the church nowadays, that one did not need to abandon Catholic mysteries or the church itself, but needed to explore other religions. Now, you'll see this is a common point in my talks, but so I'm ending with Thomas Merton here. So he was good friends with the Dalai Lama and explored in particular Eastern mysteries, because he thought that we could learn so much from them without abandoning, in particular as a Catholic, without abandoning his own mysteries. And so even just yesterday, we were speaking to a priest who was very much talking about how the concept of monasticism came from the East, and to ignore the Eastern mysteries and, Eastern concepts of practice is, idiocy, it's ignorance. And Merton was pretty much the first person to really push this, and especially in modern times. I was also known as a peacenik of sorts, and was involved in all sorts of protests and everything like that. And whenever he would leave his monastery and they would let him, also a big fan of jazz. But
I think he clashed a lot with the abbot at his monastery.
oh yeah, he was a rebel monk in a lot of ways. But nowadays, surprisingly, has not been brought into the process of sainthood yet, but is greatly admired in the Catholic Church, all the way to Pope Francis. So that's a quick overview of Catholic mysticism, esotericism, the cult of the saints, etc. It's a whirlwind view. Definitely dig more into it. Now, I wanted to do this talk because we have our own EGC, which is based off Catholic and Orthodox frameworks, and I think the more and more we take, for example, things like the Liturgy of the Hours and exploration of our own list of saints, and things like that, the establishment of lay societies and co-fraternities and etc. I think this will further help the EGC grow as a church and further develop as a force to be reckoned with against the slave religions. The more and more we seek to confine and narrow the church, and I say this, caveat, not official O.T.O statement, I say this because I see a narrowing of the church in a lot of ways. We only want to do the Gnostic Mass and nothing else when it comes to the EGC. We are a population of 75 or more or less % of clergy. Now think about how ridiculous that sounds in trying to build a church. I believe in strong, healthy lay element, and the Catholic Church has helped build that for themselves. Because in the early days, one of the things I didn't go to is in the days of the catacombs, everyone wanted to be clergy. And the church could not have that. How was it going to grow if everyone was just, a priest? And so, but in Thelema, we are all our own priests in our own sense. We are all magicians. But in the EGC, we understand that it's a bit difficult to have a community of priests and magicians who are constantly conflicting with each other in their wills. But I feel the best way to do that is to delve deeper into our mysteries outside of the Gnostic Mass itself. So hopefully you'll explore that with me, and also explore our own saints and everything else that Thelema has to offer. Love is the law, love under will. Thank you so much.
Thank you.